On a humid August afternoon in 2015, a demolition worker named Luis Acosta took a swing at a sub-basement wall that wasn't supposed to be there. The blueprints for the old Fort Holabird annex showed a solid foundation, but Acosta's sledgehammer met the brick with a hollow, resonant boom that felt wrong. After a second swing, a section of the wall crumbled, releasing a puff of stale, long undisturbed air. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut through 21 years of darkness, landing on a slumped figure in a corner. The fabric of the Baltimore police uniform had largely surrendered to time, but the metal was more persistent. A corroded badge lay in the dust, its inscription just barely legible. At that moment, the case of Officer Daniel Brock, who vanished mid-shift in March of 1994, was violently reopened. March 12, 1994, began with the smell of coffee and the sound of cartoons. Officer Daniel Brock sat at his kitchen table, watching his 5-year-old son, Michael, push a toy police car around a puddle of spilled milk. He promised his wife, Sarah, he'd be home in time to read Michael a bedtime story. It was a standard Saturday day shift, the kind filled with minor traffic disputes and the occasional shoplifter. Brock was a cop, known for his meticulous nature, a quality his superiors valued and his family sometimes found exasperating. Every report was perfect. Every procedure was followed to the letter. On the streets of Baltimore, the day unfolded with unremarkable predictability. A fender bender on Pratt Street, a noise complaint in Fells Point. Brock handled each call with the same steady, unhurried professionalism. He was 35 years old, a man settled in the rhythm of his life, respected by his colleagues for being a straight arrow in a department that had its share of crooked ones. He believed in the simple mechanics of his job. You see a problem, you investigate it, you resolve it. Shortly after 3 p.m., the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio with a Code 2 alert. A silent alarm triggered at a Fort Holabird annex on the city's outskirts. The location was officially logged as a decommissioned military surplus depot, a place full of dusty canvas tents and mothballed jeeps. For a patrolman, it was a low-priority call, almost certainly a false alarm caused by a faulty sensor or a stray animal. It was the kind of tedious task that ate up the clock toward the end of a long shift. Arriving on scene, Brock found nothing out of place. A high chain-link fence, a locked main gate, and the profound silence of a government building on a weekend. His patrol car, number 714, idled by the curb as he conducted a perimeter walk. Another officer might have cleared the call from their car, but that wasn't Dan Brock. He found a rear service door slightly ajar, the lock apparently having failed. It was a breach of protocol for the facility, a loose end that his mind could not leave untied. He keyed his radio one last time. The transmission was logged at 15:17 hours, 714 to dispatch. I have an unsecured entrance at the annex. Going to take a look inside. Code 4. The dispatcher acknowledged the call with a click. It was the last official communication anyone would ever receive from Officer Daniel Brock. For the next 2 hours, the radio remained silent. His shift ended at 1700 hours, but he never signed off. At first, it was a minor anomaly, a dead battery, a faulty radio. But as the minutes turned into hours and the sun began to set over Baltimore, the silence from car 714 grew heavier, transforming from a simple absence of sound into a dense, oppressive void. The call from the demolition site foreman was logged at 16:32 hours. By nightfall, the Fort Holabird annex was no longer a demolition project. It was an active crime scene, frozen under the sterile glare of portable floodlights. Veteran Detective Lester Freeman of the Baltimore Cold Case Unit stood at the edge of the breach, the cool night air a stark contrast to the tomb-like stillness emanating from the hole in the wall. He remembered the Brock case, a loose file from his early days, a ghost that had haunted the department for 2 decades. The crime scene unit moved with a practiced, almost silent efficiency. Their white Tyvek suits were stark against the grime as they documented the scene with a methodology bordering on reverence. The victim, Male, Caucasian. Approximate height, 6 feet. Cause of death, undetermined, pending autopsy. A single service-issue Smith & Wesson revolver lay near the right hand. 6 rounds in the cylinder, none fired. The leather of his duty belt was cracked and brittle, but the badge, once cleaned, shone with the name D. Brock. The specifics of the tomb itself raised immediate, troubling questions. The wall was constructed of modern red brick and Portland cement, inconsistent with the 1940s-era foundation around it. This was an addition, not an original feature. More unsettling was the discovery made when a technician's radiation meter began to click softly. The room was lined with thin sheets of lead, a detail that made no sense for a simple storage closet. It was a containment chamber, a sarcophagus. The initial report from the medical examiner on site was brief and perplexing. There were no obvious signs of fatal trauma to the skeleton. No bullet holes, no visible fractures consistent with a severe beating. The man inside had not been shot. He had been entombed. The first key questions began to form in Freeman's methodical mind, each one chipping away at the old, flimsy gang murder theory. Who had access to masonry supplies on a secure military annex on a Saturday in 1994? Why was the room lead-lined? What was being contained? Was it meant to keep something in, or to keep something out? The precision of the brickwork, the careful application of mortar, the sheer effort involved in sealing a man in a sub-basement. It spoke not of a frantic crime of passion, but of a calculated logistical operation. This was a burial, an erasure. The most critical piece of evidence was lifted from the dust with forceps and placed in a static-proof bag. It was a Panasonic microcassette recorder, its plastic casing warped but intact. It was a fragile vessel, holding 21 years of silence. The gangbangers Brock was supposedly investigating didn't build lead-lined rooms. They didn't brick up walls. Detective Freeman watched the evidence bag being carried out. The official narrative was dead, buried in a tomb of its own. The new investigation had just begun, and its first questions were chilling. Why seal a man in a radiation-shielded chamber to die? And what, if anything, was on the delicate magnetic tape that had shared that chamber with Officer Brock for more than 2 decades? The original 1994 investigation began with textbook urgency. Officer Daniel Brock's locked patrol car was found within an hour of his missed sign-off. K9 units were deployed, their search patterns meticulously tracing the last known moments of a fellow officer. The dogs led investigators directly to the fence of the Fort Holabird Annex, where the trail simply stopped. The scent vanished, as if Brock had been lifted into the air. When Baltimore homicide detectives requested access to the facility, they were met with a polite but unyielding refusal. The base commander, a decorated colonel named Marcus Jessup, personally denied their request, citing the sensitive nature of the materials stored within. He spoke in clipped, authoritative tones about matters of national security and ongoing classified operations. He assured them that his own internal security had found no evidence of a breach or any sign of the missing officer. The Baltimore Police Department, a city agency, found itself standing powerless before the locked gates of the United States Army. 2 days later, the investigation was deliberately steered in a new direction. An anonymous tip, called in from a payphone, pointed towards the East Side Disciples, a violent drug trafficking organization that Brock had been building a case against. The caller claimed the gang had snatched the officer in retaliation. The theory was plausible, it was convenient, and most importantly, it led the investigation away from a federal installation that had made it clear it would not cooperate. Faced with a jurisdictional brick wall on one side and a seemingly credible lead on the other, the department took the path of least resistance. The focus shifted entirely to the gang. Alibis were checked, warrants were served, and low-level dealers were sweated in interrogation rooms. But it all led nowhere. There was no chatter on the street, no body, no weapon. The gang theory, for all its initial promise, dissolved into rumor and dead ends. The silence that followed was not an accident. It was a construction. The official narrative calcified around the unsolved gang abduction, a story that was easier to accept than a confrontation with the federal government. Officer Brock's disappearance became a tragedy without a final chapter, his name etched onto a memorial wall. The Fort Holabird Annex and Colonel Jessup's firm refusal became a frustrating footnote in a cold case file. This was more than negligence. It was a form of institutional complicity, a quiet agreement to let a difficult question go unasked, allowing the truth to remain sealed behind a wall of federal authority for 21 years. Detective Freeman began the painstaking work that defines a cold case investigation, the slow, methodical reanimation of ghosts. He started with the living. Former officers, now gray and retired, were tracked down in Florida condos and quiet suburban homes. Their memories of the Brock case were clouded by 2 decades of other crimes, but a common thread of frustration emerged. They all remembered the annex. They all remembered being told to stand down. One former sergeant, his voice raspy over the phone, put it bluntly. "The Army closed that door on us, Lester. They told us to chase the gangs, and we did. Felt wrong then, feels wrong now." Next, Freeman's team built a list of every civilian who had worked at the annex in 1994. Most were dead, others had moved without a trace. They found a former groundskeeper, a man named George Bell, living in a small row house in Dundalk. He was wary, his eyes constantly checking the street. He spoke of areas of the annex that were strictly off-limits, of men in white lab coats who arrived and left at odd hours and never spoke to the regular staff. He remembered the week Brock vanished. He recalled being told not to come in that Saturday for his usual overtime shift due to scheduled systems maintenance. There had been no such maintenance on the schedule. Simultaneously, the archival deep dive began. Freedom of Information Act requests sent to the Department of Defense came back months later, yielding hundreds of pages that were almost entirely blacked out with censor's ink. The official records were a fortress. So Freeman went sideways, pulling municipal records, utility bills, and sanitation logs for the annex. It was a search for a needle in a continent of haystacks, an exercise in pure, stubborn diligence. For weeks, the search yielded nothing but administrative dust. Water usage was consistent. Power consumption was stable. Then a junior detective, tasked with cross-referencing requisitions from private city contractors, found an anomaly. It wasn't in the military's records, but in the archives of a private HAZMAT disposal company that had long since gone out of business. It was a carbon copy of a work order log from March 12, 1994. The entry was time-stamped 13:45 hours. An emergency dispatch was requested by Fort Holabird for a Code 3 chemical spill in sublevel B. The log noted a 2-man hazardous materials team was en route. But then, a second entry, time-stamped 14:30 hours, read, "Client cancelled service via phone. Stated situation contained internally. Full cancellation fee applied." Freeman stared at the faint typewritten words. A major chemical spill, serious enough to require an emergency hazmat team. It happened on the very day Brock disappeared, just minutes before he arrived at the gate. They had a crisis. They called for help. And then, for some reason, they decided to handle it themselves. They went silent. The detective leaned back in his chair, the pieces not yet fitting, but the shape of something monstrous beginning to form in the void. The breakthrough, when it came, felt seismic. The lab technicians managed to restore a fragment of audio from the microcassette. Officer Brock's voice, thin and gasping, was barely a whisper against a backdrop of tape hiss. He spoke 4 distinct phrases. Breach the air, Jessup, he locked the door, and finally, a necessary sacrifice. The name was a direct hit. Colonel Marcus Jessup, now a highly respected security consultant in Virginia, was no longer a footnote in an old file. He was the last person to see Daniel Brock alive. When Detective Freeman, accompanied by 2 agents from the Inspector General's office, sat down with Jessup, they were met not with denial, but with a carefully constructed narrative of patriotic tragedy. Jessup, now in his late 60s but still possessing a soldier's rigid posture, calmly confirmed he had ordered the sub-basement sealed. He claimed Brock had heroically stumbled upon a saboteur attempting to steal a vial of experimental chemical compounds. In the ensuing struggle, the vial was broken, the breach Brock mentioned. Following containment protocol for a hostile operative and a biochemical spill, Jessup made what he called a battlefield decision. He sealed the sector to prevent a catastrophic outbreak and the escape of a foreign agent. He claimed he had no idea the officer was still inside. For a time, this version of events seemed poised to become the new official history. The Pentagon, in a rare moment of interagency cooperation, provided documents supporting the existence of a foreign intelligence threat against the Annex in 1994. The narrative was powerful. Officer Brock wasn't a victim of a simple murder, but a casualty in a secret war, a hero who died protecting the nation. Jessup was the commander who made the impossible choice. The case was being neatly packaged, tied with a ribbon of national security, and prepared for permanent closure. But the physical evidence refused to cooperate with the story. The full autopsy and toxicology reports came back from the FBI lab at Quantico. Degraded organophosphate compounds were found in Brock's bone marrow, confirming exposure to a nerve agent. But there was something else. A forensic analysis of the brick wall and the steel door behind it revealed a methodical, unhurried construction. The mortar was evenly applied, the courses were level. This wasn't the work of a panicked team slapping up an emergency seal. It was the careful work of a mason. Furthermore, the scene inside the chamber was completely static. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned equipment, no scuff marks on the floor, and most tellingly, Brock's service weapon had never been fired. Colonel Jessup described a scene of violent chaos, but the tomb itself told a story of quiet, deliberate execution. The two realities could not coexist. The hero narrative had just collapsed under the weight of a single silent fact, a well-laid wall of brick. With Colonel Jessup's official story logged and his reputation shielding him, Detective Freeman was at an impasse. The physical evidence contradicted the narrative, but a contradiction is not a confession. He turned his attention back to the list of civilian personnel, searching for anyone who could punch a hole in the wall of military authority. His search ended in a quiet, sterile room in a Maryland nursing home with a man named Dr. Aris Thorne. At 67, Thorne was a frail echo of the brilliant chemist he had once been, his body ravaged by cancer, his mind haunted by a silence he had kept for 21 years. Freeman didn't need to apply pressure. He simply sat, presented a photograph of Officer Brock, and waited. The old man's composure shattered. Through a tearful, halting confession, Thorne dismantled Jessup's lie piece by piece. There was no saboteur. There was no struggle. There was just a clumsy mistake. A junior technician had mishandled a canister during a transfer, resulting in a containment breach of a highly volatile nerve agent. The spill was small, but potentially catastrophic. That was the call to the HAZMAT team. And in the middle of their frantic internal lockdown, a police officer doing his job had walked through an unsecured door. Thorne described the chilling moments that followed. Brock, realizing he had walked into something far beyond a simple false alarm, became disoriented by the initial low-level exposure. Jessup, seeing his unsanctioned illegal project about to be exposed, made a decision with inhuman speed. It was not a battlefield choice. It was an act of self-preservation. He ordered Brock locked in the nearest shielded chamber, the lead-lined room, under the pretense of a temporary quarantine. But Thorne provided more than just a story. He gave Freeman a small, leather-bound notebook. It was his personal logbook from 1994, filled not with words, but with page after page of complex chemical notations and structural formulas. It was, he explained, a chemical shorthand he had used for years to keep private notes, a code he believed no one could ever break. It was the complete, uncensored history of Project Medusa. Working with forensic linguists and chemical weapons experts from Aberdeen Proving Ground, Freeman's team deciphered the logbook. The truth it revealed was colder and more horrific than Thorne's testimony. The book detailed the agent's composition, the exact minute of the accidental spill, and the arrival of an unidentified LEO, a law enforcement officer. Then came the final, damning entry, written in Thorne's precise hand. It was a direct transcription of Jessup's order. Seal the chamber. Mix the mortar. He is a necessary sacrifice to protect the integrity of the project. The log even noted the name of the military mason, a specialist flown in from another base who was brought in to do the work. Suddenly, every piece fell into its place with a sickening click. The cancelled HAZMAT call, the professional brickwork, the lack of a struggle, the lead lining, and Officer Brock's final recorded words. He hadn't died protecting national secrets from a foreign spy. He had been slowly poisoned by the air in a sealed room, then entombed alive, a human loose end sacrificed to hide a secret so dark the United States government itself didn't even know it existed. Based on the deciphered logbook of Dr. Aris Thorne and the physical evidence left in the tomb, investigators were able to reconstruct the final 90 minutes of Officer Daniel Brock's life with chilling precision. The tragedy did not begin with a gunshot or a struggle, but with the quiet hiss of escaping gas in a sterile laboratory. At approximately 14:20 hours on March 12, 1994, a containment failure occurred. Project Medusa was loose in its own cage. When Officer Brock pushed open the unsecured service door, he did not walk into a warehouse full of old tents. He walked into the middle of a silent, high-stakes crisis. The air in the corridor already carried a faint, antiseptic odor he couldn't place. He saw men in lab coats moving with a tense, unnatural urgency. Colonel Marcus Jessup intercepted him immediately. There was no alarm in Jessup's voice, only cold, absolute authority. He informed the officer that he had entered a restricted quarantine zone after a minor chemical spill, and that for his own safety, he needed to submit to a precautionary isolation protocol. Brock, a man who respected procedure, complied. He was led to a small, windowless room with a heavy steel door, which he was told was a standard decontamination chamber. Trusting the word of a United States Army colonel on federal property, he stepped inside. It was at this point he likely activated his microcassette recorder, a habit of his for documenting any unusual incident for his reports. The heavy clank and hiss of the door locking behind him was the first sound of his own burial. Inside the lead-lined chamber, as the minutes stretched on, Brock began to feel the effects of the nerve agent he had been exposed to in the corridor. A tightness in his chest, a subtle tremor in his hands. He could hear muted activity outside the door. It was then he must have realized this was no standard quarantine. This was a prison. His last recorded words were not a message to his family, but a desperate attempt to create a record, to leave a witness for a crime he now understood was being committed. He spoke the name Jessup and the phrase "necessary sacrifice," likely a direct quote he overheard through the steel door. Outside, Jessup's operation was clinical. He had already cancelled the external HAZMAT team. Now, he made a call to an asset at another base. Within the hour, a specialist, a military mason, arrived with his tools. Through the eyes of a terrified Aris Thorne, the final act unfolded. There was no shouting, no violence, just the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a trowel spreading mortar and the soft thud of bricks being set in place. The wall grew, course by perfect course, erasing the door, erasing the room, and erasing the man inside. By the time the sun set, the work was done. The new brick wall was indistinguishable from the foundation around it. Colonel Jessup had contained his secret. He then initiated the second phase of his plan, misdirection. An anonymous call was placed, sending the Baltimore police on a futile chase after a local gang. The official narrative was set. and the truth was sealed behind 9 inches of brick and a wall of federal silence left to suffocate in the dark. Armed with Dr. Thorne's deposition and the meticulously deciphered logbook, the Department of Justice moved against Colonel Marcus Jessup. Federal agents arrested him on a quiet Tuesday morning at his sprawling home in Northern Virginia. There was no resistance. The man who had acted as judge, jury, and executioner in 1994 surrendered with the quiet compliance of a bureaucrat whose time had run out. His trial became a national spectacle, a window into a secret world of unchecked power. In the courtroom, Jessup showed no remorse. He was defiant, his posture ramrod straight, his testimony delivered with the unblinking certainty of a man who believed he was above the law he had sworn to uphold. He argued that the annex was a battlefield in a clandestine war, and his actions, while regrettable, were necessary to prevent a citywide disaster and protect a vital national security asset. He spoke of wartime rules and command decisions, framing the slow, agonizing death of Officer Brock as a statistic, a piece of collateral damage in service to the greater good. The jury did not agree. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and died 7 years later in a federal penitentiary. Dr. Aris Thorne, the man whose conscience had finally broken the case open, passed away peacefully in his nursing home just weeks after giving his final videotaped testimony, his confession serving as his last official act on Earth. Throughout the trial, 2 figures sat in the front row of the gallery, silent and unmoving. Sarah Brock and her son, Michael, who was now a grown man with children of his own. For 21 years, they had lived in the ambiguous hell of the unknown. The trial replaced that ambiguity with a horrifying certainty. They listened as the court detailed the last moments of their husband and father, not as a hero in a firefight, but as a victim of a cold, administrative execution. The verdict provided an ending. A name was assigned to the crime, and a punishment was delivered. Legal justice, decades late, had finally been served. But the fall of the gavel could not mend the fracture that had split their lives in 2. It offered accountability, but it could not offer peace. The verdict was an answer, but the wounds it confirmed were far too deep to ever truly heal. The demolition crews never returned to the Fort Holabird Annex. Instead, in the years following the trial, the United States government launched one final massive construction project on the site. They did not build a memorial. They built a tomb on top of a tomb. The entire annex, from its crumbling roof to the sub-basement where Daniel Brock took his last breath, was encased in thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. Today it is a featureless grey monolith, a brutalist scar on the landscape. High fences topped with barbed wire surround the perimeter. Stern, red-lettered signs warn of chemical contamination and structural instability. They are permanent warnings meant to keep people out for centuries. Officially, the site is a federal HAZMAT exclusion zone. Unofficially, it is the final resting place of Project Medusa, a secret so toxic that even after its exposure, the only solution was to bury it under a mountain of concrete, ensuring it could never harm anyone again. Officer Daniel Brock received a hero's funeral, his name finally given its proper place with full departmental honors. His family received the truth, a brutal currency that offered clarity but no comfort. They learned that he hadn't died in a confrontation with a dangerous gang, but at the hands of a man who saw his life as an inconvenience, a loose variable that needed to be eliminated from an equation. The story of Colonel Jessup serves as a chilling case study in the pathology of power, where the rationale of the greater good becomes a shield for profound evil. He sacrificed one good man, not for his country, but for his career, for his own unsanctioned project, wrapping a cold-blooded murder in the flag of national security. And so the site remains, silent. The concrete sarcophagus is a permanent fixture now, a monument to an invisible tragedy. The signs warn of physical dangers left behind in the soil and the air, but they say nothing of the secret they truly guard. They don't mention the quiet, methodical scrape of a mason's trowel or the final, desperate words captured on a fragile magnetic tape. The silence here is different. It is not empty. It is the final, permanent containment of a truth that proved more corrosive than any chemical.